Hi everyone, this is SQ, also known as Standard Quip or VARS on Discord. I made this guide about overlays. It's meant to be watched from beginning to end. I've provided chapters only for reference. There's also more guide links in the description if you'd like to learn more. But to begin, what is an overlay? Although most people think of blending modes when they use the word overlay, an overlay is, quite simply, any video that is on top of another video. A fade is technically an overlay. When making an overlay, we need to think about the visual appeal of each scene and what they will look like once combined. Understanding how clips flow and look visually appealing sequentially before you try to achieve these things simultaneously in an overlay is fundamental. So instead of jumping into how to do overlays, I need to take a step back and talk about the why of scene selection, which means we're going to talk about the art of cinematography. This is something every editor should study. It doesn't have to be a formal class, but reading up on it or watching videos will improve your scene selection process. In our case, the bare minimum to know would be about scene composition. Composition is the way things in a frame are arranged. Please learn more about it outside this video. I've included some links in the description. Two core concepts of scene composition are the rule of thirds and focal points. The rule of thirds is the concept that you separate your screen into thirds via a grid, and then you place whatever you want your actual subject on the intersection of one of those lines. A focal point is what you want people to actually concentrate on. So to form this into an actual sentence, you want your focal point to be on one of the intersections of the lines in the grid on your screen. Now that you know the absolute basics of composition, I need to mention match cuts. A match cut is when you transition between two scenes that share something about the composition. Specifically for most overlays, the thing that is going to match between two scenes in a match cut is our focal point. As an example, take a look at Violet. In this scene, she's looking at her bandaged hand. Then we cut to the next scene where she's looking at her mechanical hand. In this match cut, the focal point is Violet's hand. I'm mentioning match cuts because they're a very easy to point to example of keeping the focus on a specific point, a focal point, and having the point remain the same between two or more shots. You should strive to keep the focal point the same or very similar, as well as keep it generally in the same area of the screen. You can call it a match fade if you want, but it uses the same principles of a match cut but applies them to overlays. And this is important for fan videos because we want to make sure the audience's eye movement is where we want it to go. What I mean by this is that we want the viewer to be looking at a specific part of the screen and not darting all around. In most cases, this means you'll want your focal point, and thus where you want your audience focusing, near the center of the screen. But if you want the center of attention to move from one place to another, you want it to be in a smooth motion. So you wouldn't want one scene where the focal point is on the left side and the next scene where it's on the right. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rules. We can talk about that later, but you should learn the actual rules first before you break them. This focus on eye movement and where important things are happening on screen are core components of flow. And we really can't talk about flow without mentioning Ken Burns. While most people refer to Ken Burn as adding a slight zoom, it's actually any motion to make a transition smoother. Because we're usually not animating the shots ourselves, we're limited to the footage we have, and sometimes the scene we want to use moves. Let's say it pans to the right, and the next scene we want to use pans to the left. This is a problem because our eyes naturally follow movement, and the abrupt change of direction interrupts the flow of our video. To avoid this, we can choose different scenes, split them up so the transition is smoother, like pan right, then a center shot, then pan left, or you can manually change a scene by flipping it horizontally or playing it backwards so they all move in the same direction. A Ken Burn is also a type of manual adjustment. So let's say you have the two pans going in the same direction now, but you still want to use the center shot, which is totally still. Unfortunately, the sudden lack of motion is just as distracting, so you'll probably want to add motion to the still scene too. The type of motion we add is dependent on the surrounding scenes, so you'll want to match the context. In our case, the other scenes all pan to the right, so we'll want to add a pan right to this scene too. The last few things I'm just going to kind of list off and not go into too much detail. First is color grading and brightness ramps. Things look smoother if you can match colors and the brightness, so try and do that. The second is blending modes, also known as composite modes in some software. Knowing how they work is not essential, but I've provided links to read more if you're interested. Here's the crash course. The lighten or additive category shows everything that's lighter than the scenes below it and hides the darker stuff. The darken or subtractive category does the opposite, hiding the lighter stuff. The complex category does a lot of math related to the presence of neutral gray. Technically, there's 3 additional categories, but the modes in them are rarely useful for vidding. What I want you to take away from this is that blending modes aren't required for an overlay to look good, but they can enhance it, so play around in your software if simply changing the opacity of a scene isn't working for you. The last thing is masking. Obviously, one of the advantages of overlays is avoiding masking, but doing it anyway can make an overlay look better. If you're masking in an overlay, it does not need to be precise at all. You can do a generic shape with a high feather, and it can take away a lot of the mess and distractions, so don't shy away from it if the situation calls for it. So how does all this relate to creating overlays? We take our 2 or more shots and combine them in a way that still follows the rules of framing and composition. This is extremely contextual, but generally this means you will want one scene that serves as your point of focus, your focal point, and the other scenes will provide some type of visual flair, for example adding clouds. As an aside, you can have more than one focal point, but this should not be your default in a composition. I said before that one of the advantages of overlays is avoiding masking. This particular example of adding clouds is one such case. Instead of masking out the character and putting it on top of a sky, you could dump the clouds on top of the shot without masking anything, or only a simple shape mask or cookie cutter, which saves a lot of time while still looking decent. And what about our focus on motion? After learning about flow, you wouldn't want to have 2 scenes with opposing motion one after another. This also goes for overlays. In most contexts, you don't want 2 scenes with different motions on top of one another. Instead, you'd work with each scene individually, modifying them so they have the same motion before making them into an overlay. And that's another thing. Do not be afraid to modify the individual shots in order to make a better looking overlay. You can rotate, zoom, make things off-center. You're creating your own scene now when you're making an overlay, so think outside the box. The goal of an overlay should be for every single frame to look good and for all the pieces on screen to form a single unifying picture. In most cases, you do not want each shot to be immediately identifiable as separate from the whole. Keep this in mind when selecting scenes for your overlay. To make an overlay, choose at least 2 shots. Put one shot on the first video layer or track of your timeline, and put other shots directly above it on ascending video tracks. It doesn't matter which type of shot is on what track, but I personally like to put my foreground on the bottom and build all my background scenes above it. Making an overlay with more than 2 shots can seem daunting at first, but it's really just the simple overlays stacked multiple times. Next, change the opacity or amount of transparency on the top shot so you can view both clips at the same time. Adjust it to your desired look. There is no special opacity number as it will vary for each of your overlays. If instead you want to use a blending mode, you'd typically start with both shots at 100% opacity and apply the blending mode to the one on the top video track. After you find which mode looks best, you can change the opacity or make other adjustments to enhance your scene. As you make more overlays, you may start using a certain blending mode more often, but keep in mind that these are contextual too, so don't limit yourself to only using certain ones. Once I'm satisfied with the composition, if necessary, I will add masks so the background elements don't impact my foreground. Now that we've covered all the fundamentals for overlays, let's dive into when you might use them and some example techniques. While you can certainly make overlays just because you think they look cool, I think having a reason for an overlay in the context of the video is crucial. This reason can be of a technical nature, such as dressing up an otherwise visually unappealing scene, using an overlay as an alternative to a time-consuming mask, adding variety to your transitions, or just matching the audio at that specific point. Overlays can also be helpful for conceptual applications, like changing the atmosphere or mood of a particular scene and/or adding a story element to promote cohesiveness. Again, these things will be very contextual depending on what sort of video you're making, and this isn't an exhaustive list of possibilities. As an example of adding visual appeal, in my Esoterra vid, I used Princess Kaguya, which has a very distinctive sketchy animation style, and combined it with other anime so it didn't stand out so much from the rest of my video. In Echoes, a video about time travel, I used the monkey as a metaphor for the current state of the timeline and Jinx's feelings about it. To do this, I interspersed monkey imagery throughout the video primarily using overlays. Since the hex core, the source of the time machine's power, is blue, I also changed the color of many scenes and added overlays of the gemstone and/or its energy. As an example of changing moods, in Vengeance, I made scenes darker, added the demon, and changed colors to look more menacing, primarily through the use of overlays. In Ghost, I used overlays to help with color grading. And in Echoes, I was able to convey the passage of time in a compressed way through several flashbacks on screen at once. In this case, the composition is chaotic on purpose, but it still retains the most important information in close to the middle of the screen. Other types of overlays that may fit into these uses are things like vignettes, especially blurred edges, which can help convey things that happened in the past. Consider plot reminders. In this scene, Violet looks sad. My video is about a lost lover, so I can add an overlay implying she's thinking about them. You can also change or emphasize the environment. This scene is underwater, but it's not obvious, so we can add more bubbles through an overlay. Remember that overlays don't have to be complicated. In fact, I think the easiest way to imagine overlays are as really long fades. This is especially true when you're using pre-made overlays. While this guide has been focused on making your own overlays, an extremely popular use of overlays are taking pre-existing clips made specifically to put on top of your video. There's many types of these, but for the sake of brevity, I'm only going to talk about light leaks. While light leaks can be used in a multitude of ways, in my experience, they usually serve two purposes: forcing a particular mood, like soft or romantic, and as a transition. Similar to how adding a Ken burn can help smooth out a transition, light leaks will distract the eye just enough to smooth over a cut. Your focus shifts to the light, making the transition feel seamless. Understanding how light leaks affect eye movement will allow you to use them more intentionally by aligning the light's movement with the focal point of the next shot. Even though these clips are designed to be used as overlays, all the previous tips still apply. Don't be afraid to mask, blur, adjust motion, or tweak color to make them work, and don't forget to make sure the movement supports your shot. You can also create your own light leaks from any bright, moving footage. Here you can see I made my own light leak from a scene of a lighthouse, and again from some sparkling water. If you've gotten this far, thanks for sticking with me. I hope I've given you some new ways to think about how to create and apply overlays. At the end of the day, the only real limit is your imagination. To end this guide, I'll list some random tricks I've learned over the years that don't have any real theory attached to them. My first tip is, everything is contextual. I really can't stress this enough. Every situation is unique and may require a completely different technique than what has worked in the past. Just because something worked the last 20 times doesn't mean it'll work this time. My second tip is keyframing. What I'm about to say applies to all keyframes everywhere for all effects, but in this context, it's easiest to visualize with opacity and fades. If you are able, keyframe your fades yourself. The default type of motion between frames is linear interpolation. This tells your program to evenly distribute the change between the 2 points. This change is represented by straight lines on a keyframe graph. If I'm using linear interpolation, I like to have 0% opacity on the audio cue I'm syncing to and 100% opacity up to 2 frames after the audio cue. However, most fades benefit from Bezier curves. Many programs will have presets for most used curves called easing. Easing tells your program to vary the rate of change between 2 points instead of keeping it constant. This creates a curve instead of a straight line on the graph. In a practical sense, this usually means the rate of change slows down the closer it is to a keyframe, which can make a fade look much smoother. When fading this way, I start my clips much sooner than the audio cue and end them much later. I don't have a typical point for this. Basically, when the clip starts to become discernible is when I want it to start on the audio cue. If a fade looks kind of jerky or rough and I can't figure out why, I'll use Bezier curves if I haven't already. If that doesn't solve it, I have a few more tricks to try depending on the situation. Add a slight blur that gets blurrier as the clip fades out. Decrease saturation so it turns to grayscale by the end of the fade. Decrease brightness in tandem with the opacity, so while it's becoming transparent, it's also turning black. Keep in mind for that last one that if we're using certain blending modes, you might have to increase the brightness instead so the clip turns white by the end. Additionally, if blending modes are involved, it may be easier to change the saturation and/or brightness instead of fading at all. While we're talking about fades, when we're going deep into the overlay weeds, I like to fade from one blending mode to another blending mode. It can evoke an extremely subtle change that sometimes I prefer over a typical fade. This is a little too complicated for me to describe here, so I'll just tell you to experiment with it. If you can't get the fades to look right, remember what I said about changing brightness instead of fading, and refer back to how blending modes work either earlier in this guide or from the links in the description. If I didn't cover your program, look for the explanations in the manual or help files. Imagine a great transition here, because my last 2 tips don't really fit anywhere. Color grading helps smooth out things. You should match colors between different scenes when possible. Sometimes, using an overlay is easier to achieve this than using your program's actual color tools. Choose a clip that has colors you want the current clip to have. Blur the crap out of it. Then zoom in on the specific color you want. Now you have a color overlay you can put on your original clip. My last tip before I close out the video, are you using a still image for an overlay and it's just too still? Try adding a wave warp effect. This is useful for glitches, gases, glows, and sometimes making things look drawn. That's it from me. Remember, I've also added a bunch of links in the description if you'd like to learn more about some of the concepts. Thanks for watching, and I hope the guide has helped you in some way.